All right, Phil and Sulan. Hey, welcome to the show. All right, so we were together back in those days. One of the things that we wanted to do at the CCA is there was this myth that everything happened in the paperless studios. And I mean, this may be a good myth to have, I don't know, but there was a lot of other stuff going on all over the world. But I think now would be a chance for us to talk a little bit about how the digital hit us. And if you guys, if it hit you at Columbia University with this group of people, or if it came before that?
I think it hit us at Columbia. We started teaching at Columbia very early on. And certainly, I mean, we've talked about that in the other conversation with you as well. I think in retrospect, at the time, probably we didn't realize it as much, but in retrospect, we were sort of very fortunate to be sort of at the right place at the right time with the right group of people. Bernard, leading everything. Interestingly, even though his work is not necessarily so digital, but the fact that he recognized early on that there was something really important happening with the computer. And I also remember a kind of camaraderie in those days where we felt we were taking on the world because we were getting a lot of pushback from the outside world in terms of the value of the work we were producing because we were doing experimental work. So I do think, for me, there may have been, we talked about this before as well, there may have been, for example, we both worked with O.M. Ungers. I don't know, probably nobody in the audience remembers O.M. Ungers, but he was a kind of important architect in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And he, for example, used to talk a lot and conceptualize in his work the notion of morphological transformation. And to me, for example, that is somewhat of a precursor thought to conceptualizing with computational software. Even though, of course, we were not at that point working with a computer yet, but.
Yep. And I think the category in the topology and topography gallery, which is dedicated to ergonomics, is really dedicated to the Kuttner loft. Mm-hmm. I mean, is it fair to say that you both carved out a certain territory out of the digital at that time, which was focusing on, let's say, relationships to the body and continuity and things like that? Or was that just, did it happen that it was a loft and so it took on that topic?
And that's an interesting question. I think I would say yes, but I also would say that we're very interested in the ability of the computer to transcend scale. Yeah. So that was part of that discussion, going from ergonomics through topology, through morphology, into looking at everyday objects, for example. The way in which that would incorporate, in different scales, different memories, basically, of the way in which it was installed in the loft, and so the smoothened, actually. Mm-hmm. So a big part of that was, in fact, discovering self-similar conditions across scales, and to a certain extent, across times. And because we were manipulating on the computer, actually, sequences of times. So at that point, it was really taking a look at the way in which morphology, in fact, was installed, kind of designing in time, by time, for time. So it was a way for us to explore this hybridic sensibility using this aspect of scale. But the everyday objects is interesting for us because they sponsored also an immediacy, almost like kind of automatic response of grabbing a cup or a pillow or so forth. And the loft, in that sense, created a new kind of newly constructed domesticity.
And how do you feel, because the loft was hugely published. I mean, like cover of the Arts and Leisure, New York Times, and it was one of the first things built. And what always struck me is it was, presented as one of the first things to come out of the digital world into architecture. But it also was combined with the whole blobitexture thing. So how was that for you?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because there was a show in Pittsburgh which was sort of on blobitecture, right? And I think the discussion, that show was really interesting in that it brought out somewhat of some sort of the weaknesses of the blobitecture discussion in terms of topology, right? That there isn't really fundamentally such a big difference between a blob and a box. I mean, I guess to us, what was always important about exploring forms through the computer was the ambivalence of form rather than sort of a particular categorization, although from the outside, of course, people are at liberty to make any sort of interpretation or put you in any camp. But for us, it was, in all the projects, I think starting with the OK apartment, but also housings, which came at the heels of the OK apartment project, it was important to look at how we could push expectations, cultural expectations about form, what was, where conventional definitions were lying, for example, with the notion of home in the housings project, and how we could create a kind of a broadened discussion around form, for example, through the sort of ambiguity of forms that we could generate in the computer. And I think this goes also together with the sort of cross-platforming ideas that for the first time materials could exist in different realms, not just in architecture, but also come into architecture from other territories.
And let me just ask you real quick, because I think it's important. Can you talk a little bit about how those pieces were built and how you worked? Like, you did drawings, we've seen the drawings, but how much were you already doing the digital to fabrication bridge? And how were what role did a contractor play in that? Because I think the role of the architect changes a lot with this technology. We heard it a little bit from Enrique. I'm curious to hear it from you both.
Along the lines of what I was saying before, one of the things we were very intrigued by is we were looking for the right kind of material to fabricate the main pieces. And we found fabricators on Long Island who were actually doing, their main job was doing stage sets for the Metropolitan Opera. And they were also doing, at the same time, at that time, they were doing bobsleds for the Olympic team. So we liked this kind of great range of formal capacity and the fact that they could produce that entire range. But the apartment is more hybrid in the sense that we have other pieces that are somewhat more conventional.
But were they, for instance, the big plots in the show that were 2D, were you having to do the work to get it off the computer for them, or were they using digital tools?
No, we were doing that work.
Okay, that's what I think is interesting, is how a lot of people think the architects just showed up and adopted software and showed up and had people with digital tools build for them. So you had to train them or translate.
Yeah, no, it was a tremendous kind of ramp up, in fact. And I have to say they were terrific in the sense that they were completely on board for anything we would throw at them.
Right.
And besides the bobsleds and the Met sets, they were also working with artists like Matthew Barney. So
there you go. So your project is between Matthew Barney, a bobsled, and a Met set.
That's it.
That's a perfect definition. Yeah.
Literally and figuratively.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I hate to say it, but we gotta move on.
Okay.
All right, Enrique?
Yeah.
Thanks. Bill and Sulan, you guys stay on the couch.
This is the Greg Lynn Show with Greg Lynn, produced by the CCA.
I'm Bill McDonald.
And I'm Sulan Kolatan.
Thanks for watching.